What I have here that I wanted to show you is my super old sketchbook. I don't know, I think this was my sketchbook maybe like 10 years ago. I usually go through one of these a year, every year and a half. When I was younger, I used to draw in my sketchbook all the time with ballpoint pen. So I figured I would show you some sketches and examples of some ballpoint pen drawings that I've done. I've since, I'll show you some things from my later sketchbook too, but since then, now I use, I have a set of Tombow markers I use a lot when I sketch in my sketchbook. I don't know, I throw collage in there. I use all different kinds of materials. But back in the day, it was just me and my sketchbook and my ballpoint pen, and that's pretty much what I used to draw when I was just messing around in my sketchbook or practicing or doing different studies. Preparatory sketches for paintings and things like that were all done with ballpoint pens. So I dug out this old sketchbook, and you can see right from the first page, this poor thing is falling apart. It's in tough shape. But all of these are just sketches and studies done with ballpoint pen. I used to draw my sister a lot. And some of them are just quick and sketchy, and others of them are a little bit more refined and built up. You can see you can really get a range of value with ballpoint pen. It just takes patience and layers, especially for those darker values. I did a lot of sketches of people, and usually when I'm roughing something in, I'll just start using the side of my pen and laying in very, very light wispy lines, and then I build up to those darker lines and darker values as I go. More studies. These are some studies for a series of paintings I was going to do. So you can see here that I use ballpoint pen to draw all the time. And it is challenging because you can't erase, but it's great practice too. This was an example of a more finished one. One that I just worked up a little bit more. I use lots of hatching and cross hatching and all kinds of different freestyle layering techniques. This is my more recent sketchbook. So I use Tombow markers a lot now. But I did build up some pen there. These are some drawings of my little niece I did. These were definitely from pictures, photographs, not from actual life. That'd be really hard to draw a baby that way. But this is a good example of a lot of hatching and cross-hatching work built up and layered with pen. So just so you can see the potential, I'm going to be showing you many more examples posted on Classroom of different artists who use ballpoint pen, not just my own work, but I just thought it would be good for you to see the potential. You don't need fancy supplies to make an interesting drawing, and that's why we're going to first practice with just the technique first in our value scales, and then go to actually applying those techniques in a finished drawing. Okay, so what I recommend when you're starting each individual scale, and this is actually the way I teach it in Art 1 too. So if you had me for Art 1, this approach might be familiar to you. But when I do a value scale, I always like to start with the darkest dark. And notice how I have that to my left. And if you're left-handed, you might want to do it opposite. You might want to do your darkest to the right and work the opposite way, so that you're not leaning your hand in the darker value once you've made that. I'll leave that up to you. It doesn't really matter which direction you work into me, as long as you have your darkest dark to one side working up to your lightest light, which remains white. But as I was saying, what I like to do is start with my darkest dark and then skip over to my second to lightest, and then work with those. Once I have those two established, work with those values in between. leading up in either direction. That's up to you. That's just a suggestion. If you feel comfortable working with your darkest and just gradually getting lighter, it's however you want to do it. All right, I'm sure you'll perfect your own way by the time you get down to the fourth one. So the first one is hatching. And what hatching is a pen technique where you do a buildup of lines. You apply a buildup of lines in one direction. And I don't care which direction you choose. So I went side to side, or diagonal, I should say, across the square. To keep it uniform, I'm going to do that in each one, that same technique. You can see I worked with my lines diagonally here as well. But you can go up and down hatching, side to side the long way hatching, but keeping it all in one direction. And obviously you can see here, the more I build up the marks, the darker the value. So the more you layer and layer and layer and layer, the darker the value will become. So that's something that's going to take a little bit of getting used to when doing a ballpoint pen drawing. It's the type of thing that takes patience, okay? Don't think you're gonna make a super fast final drawing with pen. It's gonna take patience, especially with those darker values, to build up your layers of marks to achieve that darker value. Okay, so I'm gonna just demonstrate this second one from the darkest, so I'm not gonna make it quite as dark, and I'll just show how I attempt building up the layers. All right, so that looks good for now for that second one from the darkest. I'm gonna leave it like that for now. I might decide after I do the next two that I need to adjust it. The thing with pen, what makes it so different from pencil is I can't erase it. So if it needs to be lighter later, there's really no going back. So what I suggest is err on the side of caution and maybe keep things a little lighter than you would typically do in like a regular pencil value scale, and then you can always go back and darken if you feel it needs to be adjusted. But one of the things that you're gonna have to really get used to with pen is there's no erasing. Now I've found ways around that. I've used, like if I make a mistake with a pen in an actual drawing, I might use a white gel pen and sort of like rework that mistake. And there are options for it in a drawing, but for your value scale, there's no way to like completely lighten up that whole square when working in your value scale. There's no way to work backwards. So just try to get in the habit of keeping things light to begin with, and then going back and adding another layer to darken it up, for example, in the future. One thing you'll find too as you do this, you'll notice yourself probably varying how much pressure you apply as you work with different values within the scale. So like for the darker ones, for example, the darker values, for example, not only am I doing more layers of marks to achieve those darker values, but I'm being a little bit more aggressive and pressing down with more pressure to start so that it doesn't take forever and a day in order to do this. So more pressure on the darker values as you go will quicken up the process. But then it's really important that as you're doing these lighter values, I kind of like hold my pen more at an angle, and I use a lot less pressure to get the lighter value. So building up of marks is one thing you've got to pay attention to when creating different values, but then also how you're applying the pressure, how you're actually applying the marks, applying the lines, and the pressure that you use is another thing that you have to factor into this. So one little thing that I wanted to show you is a trick for evening things out. Now, you don't have to do this for your value scale. I'm more just showing you this as a technique for later on when you're making your final drawing. If you have areas that you feel are a little bit uneven, like say it happens a lot in this square where I've kind of overlapped marks and there are areas where it's a little bit darker and uneven, don't feel like you have to do this for your value scale. I'm not going to be wicked picky about stuff like that for your value scale. But for a final drawing, you might just want to even things up like that, or your eye might go to it and you don't like it. So what I would do is, say I didn't like that band right there, that's a little bit darker, my eye kind of catches on it, I would just get a white gel pen. And I put a white gel pen in those art supply kits that I sent home to you. Using it almost like white out a little bit. But then sometimes that can look a little bit noticeable, having the white just sitting on there. So after, when it's done drying, you give it some time to dry. I'm just waving it around to speed up the drying. But then you can go and hit it with a pen just very, very lightly to get it to camouflage in there a little bit better. So that's one way to hide a blemish. Again, you don't have to do that on your value scale. I won't be so picky about that, but just for future, if there's something you want to hide with the gel pen, I mean, you know, you can see how much the gel pen, can you even see that? How much the gel pen does show up against the pen pretty well. I mean, it's not like pure white. If you let it dry and layered it, you probably could get it pretty close, but it does lighten things up considerably if you have a mistake that you want to cover up in the future. All right, next scale is cross-hatching. As you can imagine, or as you might already know, cross-hatching is like hatching, only in multiple directions. So feel free, you guys, to like use this extra little band to practice the way I did up here in the last scale. If you want to like make little marks and troubleshoot above the scale before actually filling in your boxes, you may. So cross-hatching is similar to hatching, except you work in multiple directions. I actually use cross-hatching a lot when I sketch in my sketchbook, so doing the regular hatching was actually a little bit hard for me because I'm so used to like turning the paper around and going in different directions and sort of doing freestyle that working in one direction went against the way I normally do it, and it was hard I had to like really focus on staying in one direction. So cross-hatching comes a little bit more naturally to me just because I do it all the time in my sketchbook. So same thing as I said before with the darker values, you want to press down with like a good amount of pressure because you're building up to a dark value, so you can afford to press down and it won't be too dark because you know this is the darkest it's got to go. I find cross-hatching is a technique that I like better than hatching because you can get an even value more so with cross-hatching. You can go back and just hit up the areas that are too light. You can close in on some of the little gaps peeking through by bringing another layer in an opposite direction over it. So I definitely enjoy hatching better, but there are some times when cross hatching better, but there are some times when I do like to use just hatching, like if I'm filling in a background area and I want it to just be uniform and just all go in one direction. So both techniques are worth exploring. Usually when I do a drawing, I use a combination of all these techniques throughout. And so that's why I want you to practice with all different ones. So building up the layers until you get your darkest dark. You know, and the thing with pen, like, you don't need to make it perfectly solid. There might be little specks there, but as long as overall it reads as your darkest value, that works. So now skipping, again, my technique of skipping to that second to lightest value, always keeping the absolute lightest value the white of the paper, because that will always be your lightest light. So now jumping to the second one with cross hatching. And because cross hatching requires multiple layers, you want to start super, super light, right? So like I showed you before, just hold your pen at an angle and maybe practice up here first. You're just wisping the tip of the pen against the paper. Light as a feather. It's like barely there. But because I have to add another layer, I really want to keep the layers light so I don't overdo it. So now switch directions and same thing. Just let it skim the surface. Went a little bit too dark there. So I could, does kind of bother me even in the scale. Once that dries, I might hit it in the opposite direction and actually do cross hatching with the gel pen over it just to lighten up that darker area. And then I'm good to go for my 3 in between. Always remembering that it's better to start a little lighter than you think and then incrementally build up layers to make them darker, darker, darker as you need to. It's easier to make something darker, obviously, than lighter. So now you've got your 2 value scales, hatching and cross hatching. I'm going to have you stop there for today's work, and we're going to do the 2 next ones for the following day's work. So stay tuned. Don't go ahead. Stay tuned for those demos. I will try to post them as soon as I have them ready for you, but all you have to worry about first are spending your time working with hatching and cross hatching and get those scales moving evenly from dark to light as much as possible.